del lenguaje tilde están aquí interpretando hoy día. Les invitamos a los hispanoparlantes que quieran oír interpretación al español, que seleccionen un canal de idioma haciendo clic en el globo si se unieron por computadora o en los tres puntitos y luego interpretación si se unieron por su teléfono. Muchas gracias. Thank you. Thank you, Georgie.
Hey, thank you, Ron. Let's see, other announcements. Grace wants me to remind everybody to look in the chat box for instructions. Once we're underway, I will paste the community guidelines for the conference there, and she'll paste anything that has to do with interpretation there. And you can also ask questions to Stuart, or you can contact me. I'm Georgie. I started my name with BDA, so you could find me at the top of the list of participants to send me, if you want to send me something technological. Welcome. You're in Stuart Lundy's class, Becoming Biodynamic, Air and Water today. The second of 3 workshops, the second of 3 times that we get to spend with Stuart this weekend and really dive deep into what it means to become biodynamic. I want to tell you that I've had trouble making the captions work today. If you, this is really for English speakers. If you need captions, will you let me know in the chat box, and I will keep working on it in the background. What else? I want to remind you that we're being recorded, that I'm going to try and keep everyone muted to improve the quality of the recording. And so if you'll just keep in mind to keep yourself muted, unless Stuart's inviting a bigger conversation. And if you're having trouble with the video, then feel free to turn it off. Sometimes that helps make the sound more accessible to you if you're having trouble with your computer bandwidth or your internet this morning. I think that's all the announcements and all the newsy technology stuff that I wanted to share. Stuart, are you ready to take it away?
Yep, let's get started. Well, thank you, Georgie. Well, today we're on part 2 of Becoming Biodynamic. It's about the interfacing between air and water. We got a little bit into this in our previous session, and today we're going to explore that more in full. So as a reminder, there are the 3 parts of the human organism, which are mirrored in the plant. The root with the brain and nervous system, the heart with the center and the leaf, and then the metabolic pole with the flower. And today we're going to be focusing more on that middle section, where for the plant, water is breathed out, it is exhaled from the leaves, and air is breathed in. Similarly, that's what our interface here around the lungs and the heart, that's where the atmospheric air interplays with our internal water. So you can see that the analogy there working, and it's more than just an analogy. So we're really talking about flow here, the management of water, humidity, evaporation, transpiration. This is the entire process here. Again, in ancient Egypt, there were the 3 divisions. You had the Horus-headed one, you had the lion-headed god, and you also had the hippo-headed. Again, this mirroring image. Plato had something similar in ancient Greece, but he had the human being at the top, the lion again in the center, and the many-headed reptilian hydra at the base. Today, we're going to be talking about that middle system, the rhythmic system typified by the lion goddess. In Rudolf Steiner's own depiction of how the world came into being, he indicates that the manifestation of the lion out in nature is the same process at work and perfected as an animal that comes together in us as the human heart. Now, there's that could be an entire talk in and of itself, but that's just something to provide a little bit of context here. This animation is one that I made based on a diagram by the theosophist and Paracelsian physician, Robert Flood. Flood with 2 Ds. This shows the transition between spring, summer, fall, and winter. When the sun is close, the water level goes down. When the sun is away, the water level fills back up. And this matches actually very neatly what Rudolf Steiner said about rain. He said that rain is merely the absence of the sun, or rather, the absence of the activity of the sun. You can think of this in terms of distillation, where warmth is applied, the forces of the sun, something rises, and then it has a condensing chamber, which is cool. That coolness is a microcosm of the entire universe. So what we're really talking about here when we get to rain is cosmically distilled water. Anybody who's done a small scale distillation, you're dealing with a microcosm of the entire universe. Now, when that distilled rainwater precipitates again, it is bringing considerably more than just empty water. It condenses around cosmic dust, and that cosmic dust brings with it at almost homeopathic doses, trace substances, cosmic substances from the greater universe. More than 40 metric tons of cosmic dust enter the Earth's atmosphere every year. Simply knowing that really changes a perspective on what sustainable and regenerative agriculture can be, particularly if you're trying to craft the farm as a living organism that can survive from its own resources. If you distribute that idea of 40 metric tons of cosmic substance entering the earth every year, that changes how we can build new layers of soil and not deplete every year, because new substance enters the earth every season. So when it comes to managing evaporation and rainfall, we need to consider managing that with the plant in the garden. As the plant grows and germinates, it begins to emerge, and it's important during this entire phase that the roots be kept moist, not drowned, not overwatered, but moist. As this plant emerges and arises, it finally begins to spread some of its true leaves beyond those initial cotyledons. At the point when the plant is now shading its own roots, it becomes more of a self-sustaining system because it almost throttles, chokes the amount of water that can leave the soil when you compare it to just open, bare, fallow earth, where all of the water just leaves in almost a mineral fashion rather than in an organized, etheric way. The whole idea in an etheric body is that you have an organized water body which is controlled, even slowed down. And when the plant shades the soil, it does 2 things. One, it limits the amount of evaporation so that all the water is going through the plant itself. And in addition to that, shading the soil, which is represented by the blue here, it limits the amount of weed seeds growing around it. In Alan Chadwick's recommendations, you should keep the bed watered until the plants are able to shade their own roots. And in between the rows, yes, you hoe, you cultivate to, kill any weed seeds that might be germinating. But once the plants have shaded their own roots, you have a breathing, self-sustaining unit that will need considerably less water later on in the season. Now, the closeness of that spacing will depend on your rainfall. If you have a dry area, you may need closer spacing. If you have a very wet, humid area, you may have a wider spacing so that the plants can breathe more freely. And this is all going to depend on your own local climate. So these are not abstract ideas that you can apply to every farm. You have to adapt them. But these are principles that you can see with your own 2 eyes. This is an example of some of the tight spacing on our farm. And all I have to do is hoe between those as they're arising. That not only helps kill the weed seeds, but it loosens the soil so the roots can move more freely around there. And just like I'd mentioned in the previous session, any act of cultivating or plowing is letting air and light into the soil, which you need for any good root development. And here's a depiction of me hoeing around our different crops. This is one of the best ways to keep up with weeds. And many people these days, due to the idea of no-till, don't necessarily want to cultivate at all. But this is it's simply not feasible. Someone's asking in the chat, what kind of hoe do I like to use? I like to use a scuffle hoe, or what's called sometimes a stirrup hoe. There are many kinds of hoes, and everyone has their own opinion and personal preference. I personally like the stirrup hoe. There's one from Johnny's, and they have a wide hoe and a narrower hoe. If you choose the narrower hoe, you're actually able to put more force into a smaller area, and you can move the hoe around very small plants without risking damaging them. A bigger hoe might seem like it would be more efficient, but there's twice as much friction when you're pushing a wide hoe through the soil. So I personally recommend a smaller hoe so that you can put more force into a small area, and it works very well. If you have the luxury and the money, there are bronze hoes made out of copper that work even better, but they don't make them in that small size. The nice thing about bronze and copper tools is they have a much lower level of friction. That lower level of friction means it's much milder work, much easier to go through an entire bed than it is if you use a steel tool. When you push iron through the soil, it generates something of a magnetic field, which then causes resistance, particularly in a clay soil where there's already iron. It just slows everything down. But it all depends on your own conditions. Here's a video of our garden I'll show you. See if it will play. Here it is. In an ideal situation, you're not really having to think about weeds all the time. Rudolf Steiner writes that weeds, of course, have just as much right to exist as your garden plants. They're just as entitled to the water in the soil. So to get to a point where you don't have weeds, you need to treat the soil in the right way. One thing we like to do that comes close to this, particularly when we think about our animals, is that we like to keep everything alive, like those sprouted seeds in the garden. We like to bring all of our feed for the animals into the realm of the living and bring those seeds out of a dormant state. This quote is from Charles Walters, founder of Acres USA, and he says, "Only birds are naturally designed to consume ripened grains. Sprouted grains, whenever fed, erase the cost factor whenever grains are fed." Now that's a pretty considerable claim, maybe slightly hyperbolic, but the idea is fundamentally sound, because when you soak grains and bring them into this mercurial realm of the living, you nullify phytates, which are these defense mechanisms in the seed. You increase the enzyme content, you improve the protein value, It reduces the feed bill and improves overall nutrition. The only animal really suited for eating dry grains are birds. Traditionally, when people would feed grain to animals, particularly like cattle, they would soak them in either whey or water, something that with that souring impulse. So the management of water and the management of animals both come into this, whereas the first presentation is about putting the sulfur into the soil. This is about managing the water, both the water that goes into the soil and the water that goes out, and everything that flows back and forth. You can think of it as a play. Whenever there's a back and forth dynamic, you've then found a living loop. Whenever we have a concept, it should really be something that can form a circle. There's what goes into the earth, there's what goes out back to the cosmos, but then we need to be able to have the idea of, well, how does it return again? And then we have that as a true holistic system when we're thinking and tending these circles. So this is a depiction that I made, which is, it's just an abstraction. The geometry here is going to be rare on any farm, and I kind of did that on purpose so that no one will confuse this as the way they have to do it. You can subdivide your field, and this is about the mercurial process of managing and rotating animals. I like the idea of putting in gates between each paddock. And here I have a depiction of 5. It could be any number, but I prefer a minimum of 5. Then if you have your water supply and have the luxury of putting it towards the middle of your property, run the water to each section so that there is water available to every paddock, regardless of where you have your animals rotating. And in the final section, to put your garden. Around this, as part of the structure of building a living farm, you plant a living skin, because everything that is alive has an inside and an outside, and a semi-permeable membrane that keeps some things in and lets other things out. It's meant to breathe, but it's meant to be a very particular kind of breathing. When we breathe out air, it's not the same as the air that we breathe in, and that's because we're a living being. When we're trying to cultivate the farm, we need to think in that way. You could almost imagine the idealized form of a farm is almost like a bowl, a rounded bottomed bowl, or a parabolic mirror. And it's going to be aimed to the sun. So if you're in the northern hemisphere, the tallest part will be at the back, which blocks the northern winds. And if you're in the southern hemisphere, it'll be the reverse. If you're more towards the tropics, it may just face straight up. How you allow wind to flow through there will change. But in this instance, pine nuts are a good example for the side to go to the north to block those winds. There are pine nuts that exist and thrive everywhere from the equator to the Arctic tundra. So there's almost certainly one that can survive in your region. So that's a suitable possible crop. Whenever I choose animals or plants for the farm, I try to look for ones that have already adapted. They either have a long history in the area, or ideally they have a history and a use for wildlife. Even better, a history, use for wildlife, and they're useful as a forage crop for some of my animals. And then ideally, it's one that I can also have as a value-added crop for myself. For example, the Korean pine nut, or if you had wild roses, you can take the flowers, you can take the rose hips, and there are many things to make from the same plant. It's about these multi-purpose species that creates a really vibrant ecosystem. When it comes to rotational grazing, I'm really not that big of a fan of mob grazing, or what's sometimes known as cell grazing. When you push animals to eat absolutely everything, you're deliberately overriding the wisdom of their instincts. So instead of them choosing what Steiner says they will do, which is the best thing for them, and they'll avoid any poisonous plants, if you have them packed shoulder to shoulder, where they have no choice about what they will eat as if a wolf is chasing them. And that's not really what we're after in the farm. A lot of people will say we're after biomimicry and that we should imitate the buffalo who are constantly being hunted. But I feel the biodynamic model is more of the opposite. We are trying to create a space where the cow can better follow her instincts and has to worry less and less, if that makes sense. So what we've developed is the domesticated cow who has been permitted to evolve without predation, which allows the cow actually to better express her instincts. Whereas an animal that's constantly on the run has to eat whatever's in the way. And yes, they can still self-medicate, but a lot more resources are sent to the brain. If you compare the brain cavity of a wild animal to a domesticated animal, the American bison has a much larger brain cavity, whereas a domesticated cow has a much smaller brain cavity. And similarly, the wild buffalo has a much smaller digestive system, and the domesticated cow has a much larger one. So the domesticated cow has been able to develop under our protection, under our care, and more perfect her instincts. There's actually maybe a considerable danger about shifting to rotational grazing that forces animals to eat absolutely everything, because these are animals that we've protected from predation. They have sacrificed a lot of those older instincts so that they can choose the best foods for themselves at their leisure. If we then introduce what feels to the animal like predation, we're shifting them from almost like how grasshoppers work as individuals until they reach a certain critical mass, and then the grasshoppers become a swarm of locusts. Mob grazing is more like that attitude, and that can be a real problem. And someone's commenting, not to mention the release of cortisol on the nervous system. Yeah, it's a stressful experience to animals to feel like they're being hunted, which is what that does. It doesn't mean that you'll have perfect pastures. In fact, what they've discovered out west is that if some of the grasses are grazed in a mob grazing fashion, only certain wildlife species can grow. If, on the other hand, some of the tall grasses are left and it's unevenly grazed, some birds nest in tall grasses. So if you want wildlife diversity, you can't just mow everything down because it looks better for your field. Mob grazing, someone's asking, mob grazing is when you pack animals so close together that they work like an organic lawnmower. They will eat absolutely everything in sight, graze it down very quickly. And that's useful. If you're trying to recover and restore land, it's a really good way to get manure on every part of the field, and it forces them to eat things that they might otherwise not want to. I will say I used mob grazing to help get our field back to a state where it would grow grass. When we were first here, grass wouldn't grow, and even the weeds turned brown in winter, not in winter, in summer. So we almost had to force the animals to eat in a mob setting. Now we had to, when you're in that kind of setting where the weeds themselves will not stay green, we had to supplement a lot in order to bring the fertility of the soil back to life. So I'm not a big fan of overriding the animal's instincts. We want the animal to be able to follow the wisdom of her instincts as much as possible under our protection. I feel like it's almost going the wrong direction when we're forcing them now to just eat everything. So I like to mix animals together, but not to such a point that they feel that same pressure. So in our rotations, I mix sheep, chickens, geese, cows. They're all moving together. I don't follow them in rapid succession like other models do. I found it's actually a lot more work and doesn't really seem to help the animals very much. If you provide more space, the cows will choose what they want, the sheep will choose what they want, and you just keep them moving. And then you may still have to mow sometimes. That's not the end of the world. So I like to rotate from section to section and then back. In this setting, where you have 4 divisions, this allows the animals to move from section to section. And let's say you had only 4. You could leave the animals a week in one place, move them a week in the other, a week again. By the time they get back to the place they were before, it's been over a month, which, as long as it hasn't been overgrazed, it has broken the parasite cycle largely, because most parasites tend to have a 4 to 6 week living period outside of an organism. Then they're not able to re-ingest the parasite. So simply doing that allows them to escape. Yeah. Yes, animals do not ideally eat plants below the 8-inch range, and if they do eat lower than that, that's actually where more of the parasites are, because parasites outside of a living organism can only move about 6 inches. So they'll move maybe out of the manure and climb up the grass, but they'll only climb up to about 4 inches. So if you can prevent grass from being grazed lower than that, you'll have far less in terms of parasite pressure. So this is all that mercurial flowing rotation and how to manage the grasses, which are the gentle etheric exhalation from the farm. This can though go further. You can then actually rotate your garden. You can move the entire garden to another section. This is provided you have the luxury and the space and your infrastructure will allow it. But then you can have the animals grazing the field where you used to have a garden. And every year, every couple years, move the garden to another section. And as long as your infrastructure is centrally based, it barely matters where you do that. Now, you might find you'll want to use something like silage tarps in order to smother the grasses, or canvas, something like that, in order to convert it back into pasture. But yeah, by doing this, the entire farm can become more of that living organism where it is cycling within itself everything it needs. And it's really a remarkable thing when you start to do it. There are certain biodynamic farms which really do this kind of model, and even on a fairly large scale. If the animals are moved daily, it depends on what your acreage is and what your stocking rate is. I'm personally moving in my field to a kind of semicircle, and I want to put in 12 divisions. And every time the moon changes sign, move them to a new section. So there'll be like a Capricorn paddock, then there'll be a Virgo paddock, there'll be a Scorpio paddock. And I want to see how those develop when they only have animals on them for that particular moon, if that makes sense. It's going to be an experiment, but that's the direction I'm moving. If you have the luxury of every day, yeah, it's as many as you can, but I would at least have it so if you're doing it every day, I would do 28. Again, a moon cycle, that's where most of the parasites work. So by the time they make it all the way back, it has been 4 weeks. That's what I would like to do. You can follow our progress. We're at Perennial Roots Farm, and we're in Accomack, Virginia. We're on Instagram. But yeah, that's the direction we're going. We had such a bad drought this year that we actually suspended rotational grazing to allow the animals to find whatever green was out there. But we're going to start it right back up. But we just opened it up and let everyone mix. But you can see our videos, and the animals get along very well. Pigs, sheep, cattle now. It all works very nicely. All right, and this quote again from Paracelsus to remind us that which burns is sulfur, which we talked about yesterday. That which evaporates is mercury, and that which remains in the ash is the salt. And most of farming these days is dealing with irrigation, mercury, and with the ash or the salts, the soluble salts. And they're often leaving out that sulfur aspect. Nature is pretty forgiving, and unless you're in a particularly arid region, um, uh, like everyone in the East Coast basically doesn't have to think about irrigation the same way as if you're out west. It's just a very different thing. Um, yeah, very different thing. But that aspect is that mercurial middle about controlling it. Actually, where I am, I have the opposite problem. I need to think about good ventilation, humidity, dew condensing on the leaves of my plants. So I need to think about getting the air moving so that interface between air and water is improved and they breathe out more dramatically. Yeah, someone's asking about silage tarps. I'm going to get to that a little later, but I'm a big fan of silage tarps. Some people might be worried about them being plastic or about phthalates. I'm not particularly worried because the more you read about what microbiology can do to these secondary metabolites of plastics, it's really remarkable. And I really believe in the power of life and the power of good life to digest these byproducts. And I don't think that the small amount of plastic that might go into the soil at all matches what people are eating when they're having plastic shrink wrapped food from the grocery store in every single case. It's a step in the right direction. It may not yet be perfect. I'd prefer one, made out of hemp or something. That would be an ideal one that's biodegradable but lasts for a very long time. But we're in a transition economy right now. We're not there, and you do what you can right now. But there is a statistical correlation between the amount of microplastics in someone and diabetes. So some people have raised that up. I'm like, well, they're not going to get diabetes from whatever amount of plastic, which would be immeasurable, from my garden. They're going to get it from eating the stuff from the grocery store that's full of plastic. So I'm not that worried about that aspect, particularly when you use the biodynamic preparations, rotational grazing. If you get that soil life up to the right level, it's breaking down things that you wouldn't imagine they could break down. They really can. Yeah. So I'm going to read this quote. This is again from Valerius, which is a kind of a restatement. He says that the two main forms of fertility here are fatness and humidity. He says, since neither earths nor salts supply homogeneous nutrients to plants, it follows that the benefit of manure consists in supplying land with a sufficient amount of fatness and humidity. So the first presentation is about enriching the soil with that fatness, but this part is about the water, and it's about regulating the water dynamics on the farm. And that's where you do not want to overgraze your field, and you do not want your plants spaced out the way that they often recommend in agricultural texts. You want them as close as possible without suffering from stagnant, damp air. So if you're out in an arid region, you will be able to get them much closer than I will, because I'm at 32 feet elevation, and in either direction, I'm 15 miles from either the Chesapeake Bay or the Atlantic Ocean. So I have a very different problem to deal with here. The only saving grace of where I am is that we have really well-draining soil. So even if we get a lot of water, it drains, and we've got the coastal breeze that tends to lift the dew off fairly early. I did find that if you have morning shade on your garden and you have dew that tends to collect, you're going to end up with a lot more fungal problems, a lot more of an aphid problem, because they're in many ways the same kind of process. Steiner refers to aphids as like this aberrant flower process that's occurring on the leaf. And the way I like to think of it is that it's almost like every time a plant exhales, there's a little bit of that plant that goes out, including something of nectar, even from the leaves. But aphids require there to be a blanket of humidity. That's why they tend to be in stagnant greenhouses, or when you have too much dew that condenses, or it's really wet. They show up there because they require damp air. If you can simply reduce that condition, you're going to have less of it. It's not that the plants don't continue to leak that nectar, it's that it dries out. Yes, I'll slow down, sorry. Yes, someone makes a comment that my guess is that you can expect more of the less desirable forage if your paddocks aren't already with good grass cover, if you're allowing what sounds like absolute forage selection. The livestock will surely eat down their favorite forage, ignoring and allowing plants that could crowd the desired forage. Yeah, there is a possible tendency that they will weed around undesirable plants and simply not eat them. And that is one of the arguments for something like mob grazing. What you're dealing with at that point is if you're trying to eradicate invasive species and restore an ecological balance, yes, mob grazing makes sense, because if you force them to graze down a lot of these other species, the grasses will begin to take over and can choke out them. And once you've attained that, it's more favorable to allow the animals to have a greater selection. Now, if you wanted, what I would tend to do is to allow them to have their free choice, and then I would come back through and mow it down to 6 to 8 inches, even if they didn't eat it. I wouldn't go any lower than that, but I would go through and just bush hog anything that they perhaps didn't chomp on themselves. So if you were to look at a streamlined figure, like say a pine needle, you're going to see it's very aerodynamic and the air moves very quickly around it. And the taller you get up on a mountain, the smaller the leaves tend to become. So they're really hardened, almost like tiny little needles. Whereas if you get something that's more rounded, you're going to get a very different effect and have this chaotic effect of vortices on the other side. This is how we can start to think about how we lay out our garden and how we plant things through the field. Yes, someone's making a comment that Maria Thun has very interesting ways of eradicating weeds with seed ashes. That's true, and that is what we're going to deal with in the next presentation, which is on salt, minerals, and ash particularly. Yeah, because that I think is a very important concept, and I think it actually makes the most sense in the light of these 3 alchemical categories. So I'm going to try to explain it this way, but it's a good way to approach your weeds. Now, if you have a jagged shape, you're going to have all sorts of vortices created, and maybe you want these. Maybe you want disturbed air. Maybe you want to stir air in your garden. It really depends on what you're after. Are you trying to block air, or are you trying to generate a drying effect? The more vortices you have, you're going to have a bit more of an effect there. So the further up you go, the more you see this kind of effect. This is the Venturi principle, which is that there's almost a pinch that occurs. The higher up in altitude you go, all of the lines of force get pinched, and it's accelerated at that point. Steiner says something very similar when he says that a tree, as mounded up earth, is surrounded by a cloud of astrality. For me, this is very close to this. It's a cloud of lines of force. The more leaves there are, the more vortices there are. Every single leaf is causing a disturbance in the air there, and not every tender, soft little insect can survive up there, which is why many of them now live in the garden and not up in trees. The further up you go through the mountain, the more astralized it is, and the harder it is for tender plants to grow. When you get down towards the ocean, that's where you have this blanket of humid air, where things tend to stay warmer longer It takes maybe a little longer to warm up when it is warm, but there's this thermal blanket. This can cause problems, but it can also be a benefit depending on what you're trying to grow. But this principle applies to how we lay out the garden. Here's an animated visualization of what happens there. We can create this kind of effect within the garden or even within a greenhouse. If you imagine cutting this picture in half, you could make a greenhouse that tapers to a bottleneck, and you will encourage this bottleneck effect, this wind tunnel effect, to happen through the entire greenhouse. Particularly if one side of your greenhouse is lit and that bottlenecked area is cool, which causes this contraction. So you can put it under a tree, or you have a shade tarp on one end, and that one end is smaller. You will generate an automatic breeze as long as there's enough light and there's enough of a differential there. But we can manage this also within the garden and how we want to tend our crops. So here's a depiction of 3 different items in the garden. On the left, we have a picture of a plant directly in the soil. In the middle, we have a plant in a raised bed. And on the right, a compost pile. On the left, you can see that the plant is in direct contact both with the water that's in the soil and with that cool, damp air that comes in every evening. This is a really important fact, but every evening there is a cool blanket of air that comes in that is at almost 100% saturation. This is every night, and this is even in deserts. Knowing this and following some of Maria Thune's indications, if you have a very dry soil and you cultivate it in the evening as the shadow has already covered your garden, that blanket comes in and will then go into the soil. As in, you can almost water your plants by tapping into that dew. Now, if there's a hard crust on the outside and it's not breathable, that can't happen. Conversely, if you cultivate around your crops in the morning when it's wet, and then the sun rises, you get all of that evaporative power, and you can actually dry your bed out a bit. So there's this dynamic, and this is where someone asked a question about climate change. As the climate becomes less predictable, we need to be using these processes more directly ourselves. So the middle picture shows you how the plant has almost lifted its neck. I know it's an upside down thing, but let's just say it's lifted up above that blanket of air, and it's less likely for dew to condense there. It warms up easier, and the air moves faster around it. So it dries out. As anybody who's harvested herbs knows, you don't just warm them, you need to put them at a place where there's a breeze, where there's a fan or in a barn loft, where the air is constantly moving. The drawbacks of woven plastic over beds, it depends. If you want to retain more moisture, it will help do that. I don't use any woven plastic in the garden at all, but the drawback would be, it holds a lot of water. It really does. It's the same concept of covering your compost pile, which you want to keep water in, but there are benefits. I can't say that there aren't for using landscape fabric, or people wouldn't use it. But I'm not a huge fan of it. I don't like that. I like to be able to work the soil. I like to be able to open it, and that's a lot of back and forth and having to cut holes in it. I don't personally use it. The drawbacks, I don't know. I like the soil to be able to breathe regularly. If I smother them with the silage tarp, it's only for a few weeks. It's enough to cause the weed seeds to germinate under the influence of warmth and moisture, but they don't have light, so then they perish. I only leave them for a short period of time. It's not enough to actually suffocate any biology in the soil. So you can see how a raised bed has raised up slightly above that blanket of humidity that comes in, but its roots are also lifted up below the level of water in the soil usually. So this helps if you have a heavy soil that tends to be waterlogged, it helps the roots not drown. Now I've tried both of these methods and found that on our sandy loam soil, as long as I have a good breeze and don't allow it to get overgrown, I can get away with doing what's on the left. The middle, though, we tried raised beds because our soil is already so well draining. I actually had a problem that the roots weren't getting down to the water fast enough, so I did away with that. But anyone who has more of a clay soil, anyone who has a heavier soil, might benefit from mounding up, even slightly, because that cloud of astrality, those lines of force, are stronger around a plant when it is raised up above the average level. Yeah, in hugelkultur, which is similar to this mound actually, you can have a very interesting situation where the carbon in the wood that's built into this hugelkultur. For those who don't know what the term is, hugelkultur is hill culture. You make a hill that's out of carbonaceous materials like wood chips, things like that. Those absorb a lot of water. Now, because it's hilled up, it does allow water to drain more easily. But because there is all that woody material, there is still retained moisture that is accessible to plants. And you're going to notice there's more of a breeze at the top of that little hill. So your plants at the top of that, as long as they're able to reach their roots down, they will do very well and ripen very well. So particularly if they're on the sun-facing side of the hugelkultur, they'll have a microclimate. They'll warm up earlier and they'll ripen faster because they're exposed to that extra heat that is on that south-facing or sun-facing side. And here's an example of doing a whole raised bed system. If you have the entire farm set up this way, or the whole garden, you'll end up with channels of foggy air. Even if it doesn't look foggy to your eye, it is. The walking paths will fill with foggy air, which rolls in the evening, but doesn't quite spill up over the garden. Now, this isn't absolutely true, but the wettest air is always going to be lowest. So simply lifting your plants up a little bit will help significantly in terms of helping them dry out and helping against fungus and helping against mildew, similar problems like that, aphids, all of that. So you want to improve that airflow. On the other hand, if you have plants that tend to dry out too quickly, if you look at indigenous practices out in the arid southwest of North America, you'll see that they actually dig into the ground. Quite the opposite effect, where water can be retained. And some of them, there'd be slopes dug so that dew and rainwater could collect to one spot and then grow there. So there are many ways to approach this. But you could call these moon forces, this watery aspect, which Steiner refers to. If there's too much water, you will have considerably more of a fungal problem. And if I go back a slide or two, you go back to this one, the soil level will almost lift up to that green level. And on the leaves, the fungus will say, this feels like soil, I'll grow here, and I'll feed off the sugars that are in the plant and coming out of the plant. What you want to do is make it inhospitable to fungus. And that's really what this is all about. How do we determine the range of conditions where something like a pest or fungus can survive, and then just shift them one way or another so that they still favor our plants and favor our crops, but they're no longer favorable to fungus. It's really that simple. It's shifting that survivability range one way or the other. But knowing what these conditions are. So when you're dealing with a pest, you could almost imagine that you wanted to grow that pest as a crop and say, well, how could I grow powdery mildew as a crop? What would make it happy? and study those conditions as if you're going to grow it, and then say, okay, I'll do the opposite of this. But then make sure you're not eradicating any conditions that say your tomatoes need. And it's really that simple, but you get to know the organism itself, not as a problem, but as a symptom of conditions that you can change. That makes sense. So here's an example of bees flying everywhere. Steiner talks about the benefit of flying insects through the garden. Everyone will immediately go to, of course, pollination, but you might see where I'm going with this. Steiner says that birds and insects flying through the garden astralize the air. And you can see in this picture, they actually add new lines of force. It's like a million tiny little fans blowing everywhere. They will have, almost miraculously and maybe counterintuitively, even if the bees don't pollinate your crops, they have an antifungal effect throughout the garden because they're helping stir the air everywhere they fly. And this is why we should have aromatic herbs all around the garden. We should have them through like alternating rows or even a perimeter around the entire garden so that we stimulate as much of this as possible, particularly if we have that fungal problem. And we'll find that the plants ripen better when they're exposed to the right amount of astrality in the air, that these lines of force work better, and we have fewer fungal problems. When Steiner says that spider webs are actually woven out of the astral stream, and that's a rather seem like a confusing statement until you look at where spider webs tend to build their webs, and it's usually where there's a draft. So there are lines of force, there is astrality, and that is an indicator of will. Something wants to go this way, and they build their webs there so that they can just kind of passively catch it. It's like a fisherman throwing a net where there's a natural channel of water, and it's automatically moving this way. But we can stimulate more of that by bringing these insects. Someone's mentioning, yeah, borage. Borage is great for that. There's so many of these beneficials that you can bring to the garden, even if you never plan to use them yourself. Now, I recommend using medicinal plants because you can often cut the flowers, use them for tinctures, try them for an herbal tea, or this is one of the best things, save them and put them in your compost pile. And then they'll grow again, and you just keep, it's like cut and come again. But this is part of, if you want to think of it, it's part of balancing all of the watery evaporative processes by stimulating these. You're providing habitat for things that stir the air. And it's one of the best things you can do for your garden, simply having these near there and flying through them. So someone's asking, so astrality is both lines of force and bringing animals to the farm. Can you give a brushstroke of thought to connect this? Yeah. When you are chewing food and then cooking food, that has a strong astral effect. It's almost a weathering effect. And when you have wind drying up water, that's a weathering effect on the water. And too much of it, if you've ever driven like with a tender plant in the back of a truck and gone too fast, you'll see it'll get burned by the wind. So if that makes sense, those are actually very closely related processes. There's astrality in general, which is the movement of air, light, and warmth. Those things which, if you have too much of them, will just reduce something to dust. Too much wind, too much air, too much light. It'll oxidize it, dry it out, or bake it to dust. So all of those, broadly speaking, belong to astral conditions. And this is where plants don't have that internalized. Plants depend on the right amount of astrality around them. So we can help culture that. We can help bring that to them, but they can't cause the atmosphere to be warm. Whereas a mammal, we can keep ourselves warmer by eating more food and then using that as fuel, if that makes sense. Someone's asking, are you saying that biodynamic grazing is only selective grazing and to do otherwise isn't biodynamic? Oh, no. There are so many ways to approach this. I just personally find that using mob grazing is a remedial measure to restore an ecosystem, and I'm absolutely happy to do that. That's what I used. But once you've restored ecological balance and you're addressing these invasive species or things you don't want, it is healthier for the cow if they can choose what is best for them and use their instincts, because they will be able to self-medicate that way. And not just that, they'll choose the forces they need from the plants based on their highly attuned sense of smell. And then that will actually result in a more valuable manure. If they're choosing what's best for them, they're also choosing what's best for you. In the mob grazing situation, it doesn't mean you can never use it at all. It's just, I think it's more of a remedial thing. And Steiner says something similar about like a raw food diet. He says it's great as a therapeutic thing. He was himself mostly a vegetarian, but he was not an advocate of raw as a lifestyle. He thought it though had great therapeutic benefits for kind of restoring a balance, and then you can proceed to what he could a vegetarian lifestyle. That was his attitude. So yeah, I'm not saying you can't do any of this. I'm just saying there's an ideal to aspire towards, and we're never going to be there perfectly. I'm not there perfectly, but ideals are always they're always a challenge, because you're never quite there and you never can be, but you're always getting closer. So every year I try to get a little closer. Someone's asking a question in the chat that says, what is the range of acre for goat sheep in the Pentagon? 3 acres. How many animals in that space? That's unfortunately the honest question is it depends, because it's complicated. It depends on your soil, your climate. It depends on how much rain you get. If the grass grows back really quickly, like it does in my area usually, I can stock more animals there. If it's what Alan Savory refers to as like a brittle environment where there's not enough rainfall to regrow quickly, you have to stock it way lower, or you can easily overgraze. So it's going to depend, and you'll be able to feel that out a bit. But my best recommendation would be to visit anyone in your region who has animals and see what their stocking rate is, even if they're not doing rotational grazing. Just see what they're able to keep alive on an area, because if they're able to keep alive a herd of cows at a certain area without rotation, they will then you will always be able to stock more if you're rotating. So you can use that as a kind of dynamic measuring stick to determine what you'll then be able to do on similar and better conditions. So you can even start, I would do less than what they have just to be safe, because people tend to overstock naturally. All right, so this next preparation is what is known as the horn silica. And this horn silica is made by pulverizing quartz to a fine flour, mixing that with some water into a kind of paste, almost like a dough. That is stuffed into a cow horn and buried over summer. Then it is extracted and you can store it in the sunlight. This may seem like an odd process, but what you're able to create here is your own silicic acid. Silicic acid has been getting a lot more attention in agriculture. There are even conferences to silicon in agriculture now, which is really refreshing to see. But a laboratory could almost certainly make a more chemically pure product than what you can on your farm, but that's really not the point for us. What our point in biodynamics is the ability to produce everything yourself. The amount of money it takes to keep a laboratory going that can produce silicic acid on a large scale is massively expensive, whereas some rocks from your farm and a horn, that's really cheap. And when you count the number of labor hours, it takes very little time as well. Yes, someone's suggesting that the county extension office provides lots of info on stocking rates based on soil type, rainfall. Perhaps you could reach out to them. Exploit your local extension agency. If you have one and you have the opportunity, it's their job to help you. And it doesn't matter whether you want to be a biodynamic or not, or organic or regenerative. It's their job to help you. So use them, absolutely. Like they're a wonderful resource, and just let them know this is what you're doing, and say, this is the stuff I'm not compromising on. How can you help me get to this goal? And they will. Like, that's because it's their job. But yeah, someone's asking if it can be goat horn. I don't know. I haven't tried it with a goat horn. I know some people have. You might test it to see what it did, but you would almost need to do both side by side and then do a trial where you stirred some of it at the same time in 2 buckets. You could even have it attached, so 2-pronged stirring. And then you sprayed that out on one half of your tomatoes and the other on the other half to see how it performed. That would then, and document it, take pictures, because there's not enough evidence of the difference between these different things. So I don't want to come down with an opinion one way or another. It might work best with the cow horn. You might even find that yours works better if it's your goat horn. But I don't want to give an opinion on the matter, but you would need to test it. This silicic acid provides to the plants a real integrity, but in particular, it helps with transpiration. It allows the plant to breathe out more water if it's waterlogged, and it allows it to hold water in if it's a drought. It improves its sensitivity to light, increases photosynthesis, which increases the amount of sugars in the plant, which increases the Brix level. That in turn also increases the amount of sugars going into the soil, which improves the microbiology. And if you've applied some of the soil preparations in biodynamics, well, it feeds that specific process. So these are meant to work together. This you can apply as a very fine mist. As I use it as a kind of foliar spray. So, and you do that early in the morning, just as the plants are starting to wake up. So then their first big inhalation, they take in the silicic acid. At least that's how I imagine it. And you tend to spray that in the morning. Someone is asking, can you apply 500 and 501 together? I would tend to not do that. The 500, I like to apply anytime I am disturbing the soil as a kind of gesture to give back something. And if you're in a market farm, you may not be relying on the calendar because you have to keep producing. I tend to apply the 500 whenever I'm cultivating, turning in cover crops. Anytime there's a soil disturbance, I like to use something like that, or barrel compound, something comparable. And in particular, if you're turning in cover crops, it's good to spray 500 horn manure and then turn it in immediately. You'll find cover crops digest much faster, and only in a matter of days to weeks and not months, simply by coating them with this, basically this animal process. They're going to digest in a very different way. So this quote is one of my favorites from Paracelsus, and he says, "They want medicine from overseas, though better medicine grows in the garden right in front of their homes." If you were to forget almost everything I've said and just remember this principle, you will get much closer to a biologically dynamic approach to gardening and farming by using this principle. If you look out in nature, look for the conditions that you want to cure. For example, if you have a very dry garden, look out in the desert and see what plants thrive in very dry conditions. Conversely, if you have very damp, heavy clay full of water, look out for that in the wild and look for medicinal plants that thrive in wet conditions but would have no fungus, no mildew, and produce beautiful fruit. So something like, say, elderberry, which can thrive on the riverbed. There are already many medicines growing in your spot, perhaps even on your farm, perhaps even as those weeds that seem to be the problem out in the pasture. These are often the very herbs most needed for the or therapy on the farm. They should be at least composted, but a decoction might be made of them, and you might even find, if you turn them into their kind of own specialized compost or preparation, that you will be able to counterbalance some of the problems out there. So yes, same approach for human medicine. You look for the same condition out there, look for what thrives there, and you can often find your own medicines. That's kind of the logic here actually behind the Equisetum arvens. It can survive in very wet soils. It's a very primitive plant, and yet doesn't drown. And it can provide a similar impulse to your plants in particular. So Steiner writes, well, says that in the agriculture course, that when you end up with fungus growing on the grains of plants, this is actually an excess of moon forces that have reached up and caused the grains to rot. So as you know, you can make a sourdough out of most grains by grinding it and soaking it later. But we don't want that to happen on the living plant. When the plant has too much water, it grows fungus. Like here, for example, this is the conclusion of what corn smut, which is also a delicacy. This becomes an actual soil. Like if you were to smell that, it smells like the most beautiful soil when it finishes. That you want that in your soil, but you don't want it growing on grain crops. But you can see this is a particular example where I deliberately gave the plant excess of manure and excess of water, and you can even see that the corn is germinating because it's that wet sitting there. And you can see that it has turned to literal soil. So when Steiner says that an excess of water forces, moon forces, cause the plant up here to become a second layer of soil, he's not kidding. He's not being poetical. It's quite literally true. A fungus that would normally live in the soil lives up here because it finds the moist grain to be a perfect substrate, perfect atmosphere for them. And someone saying, yeah, there's food and medicine all around us. And it would boggle our minds to understand how some of these commonplace plants, even ornamentals that we plant in the front yard, what therapeutic properties they could have for the garden and for the farm. Now, I'm not suggesting that we immediately go to substitutes for the biodynamic preparations, but there are certain conditions on your farm that may not specifically be addressed by the preparations themselves. Not to say we shouldn't use them, not to say we should jump to substitutes, but we should consider what's going on around, if that makes sense. So Steiner writes in, I think his collected work, GA 312, Spiritual Science and Medicine. He says that any decoction made out of leaves, the leafy stem part of a plant, directly affects the mercurial middle. And that's why, for me, making the decoction out of Equisetum very much is a direct activity on that middle portion of the water management and the circulatory system of the plant. The recipe is you take Equisetum arvens, horsetail, You simmer it as a decoction. And if you follow Lily Kalisko's recipe, you leave that to sit for about 10 days. This allows it to ferment, at which point it becomes even more effective according to her experiments. Yes, wheat locoche is the Spanish s'more corn smut. It's an amazing organism, really. But knowing like how the fungus occurs in the first place makes it easier to culture it if you want it on purpose. Like a lot of chefs will ask, "Do you have this?" And almost every organic farmer who grows corn will have it and considers it a pest. But you could do it on purpose, and it's not contagious. If that makes sense. Yeah, chopping it up would be ideal. I don't add any molasses. No. Just allow a spontaneous fermentation in itself. And yeah, Eliana's comment, thank you very much. Yes, there's so many medicines that were traditionally added to compost pile by indigenous peoples. And the chances are if you have a certain tendency that there's this one herb that everybody uses because the climate demands it of you. It's harder for humans to live there, so they use this specific companion plant. That should be in the compost pile. If not as a preparation, at least add it, offer it to the compost pile so that the plants will also be assisted. And this is already happening. It's just there's going to be nuances in every location based on soil and climate. Someone is asking, what is the name? Lily Kalisko. I'll write that in the chat. Lily Kalisko. Yes, you can dilute the equisetum, 9 parts water to 1 part fermented equisetum. And if it ever seems to go dormant, you can just make another decoction, let it cool, add it back. It will wake right back up to life. So a further dynamization that you can do is adding fish to your animal waterers. This will stop the water from being stagnant. The fish will live almost entirely off of, say, mosquito larvae, and they keep it stirred, they keep it fresh, and they don't allow mosquitoes to reproduce there. So it's a good way to keep the water moving. And I imagine that water spirits would be quite pleased, quite tickled at that. And there's no harm to the cows. You can put water with fish in it versus water with no fish. And in my experience, they're not picky between the two, and cows are pretty sensitive when it comes to what they're going to drink. So the ideal water for soil is rainwater, which is that distilled in a cosmic sense, but it brings all of those trace minerals. And so there is a difference between well water and rainwater. And knowing the difference is really significant. And this is where rainwater catchment really should be something we're all practicing as much as we can, because it brings a very different thing to the soil. If I bring, say, my well water, there's sulfur in it, there's iron in it, and in measurable quantities that I probably don't want for my garden. They're just qualitatively different. It's a difference between, like I said, distilled water and hard water. Now, ideally, it's something a little in the middle, and that's what rainwater brings, is the right amount of trace minerality to the soil, that a healthy soil will be able to receive both the rain and these cosmic substances to such a point that we won't have to think about trace minerals the way we usually do. Someone's asking, oh, what is horsetail used for? It is an antifungal effect that helps cancel out the excessive wateriness in the soil. You could use it as a foliar spray for a direct application, but if you used the horsetail ferment to water in your squash, you won't have powdery mildew as a problem. It's a huge amount of natural silica, yes, which if you make the decoction, releases it into the soluble form as silicic acid. And you've got to think, it's as close to a mineral that a plant can get. It is almost pure quartz. And in that sense, it helps other plants become more like that instead of being too watery, too flabby, too wet. So that's the image I like to use. It's all stem and it's no leaf. So it helps the plant stand up firmer and develop stronger stems, a better, stronger circulatory system. If we extend this idea further, the idea of stirring, here's a picture of two pipes with the same amount of pressure. The one on the left you can see is not moving nearly as fast. There's stagnant water, then friction on the sides. Whereas on the right, all that is inserted is a single coil of wire. Water prefers moving in spirals and in circles. Simply adding this to a garden hose will increase the flow rate. So everything here is about increasing and improving the rate of flow. If you did this to your well pump, you're going to get a better flow rate through the garden, and it will be less strain on your well pump. That's just how water works. You might have to do several of these spaced out, depending on how long your irrigation line is. But you can improve the flow of water simply by adding this in there. It's a very, very simple way to do that. So yeah, this is where Steiner says, nature gives silicic acid, lead, mercury, and arsenic with the rain. Now, these are in very, 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 very small amounts, small enough amounts that they act as a stimulus, not as a toxin. So this is what he says they're bringing, these substances that and forces that are in such small amounts that they would have been immeasurable in his time. Like they would be parts per trillion or even more finely diluted. But this stimulus is needed because I'd almost imagine that when animals eat their food, they're absorbing these particular forces. Yes, you can add the spiral rod into a hose. You would just take it, and I would put it on the exit side, so then you can seal it back up, and it doesn't like slip through the hose. But yeah, it's a great little way to do it. There's more on that online, but it's a very thought-provoking image. And this is where Steiner says that rainwater is actually necessary for the manure, in a way. I think this is in large part because when animals eat, they're taking out the cosmic forces and using them for themselves. So of course it needs to be replenished. Now, fortunately, nature is very forgiving, and she brings these things to us without us having to think about them most of the time. This isn't true for everyone, obviously. Here's an example of what happens when we use a silage tarp. The two rows on the right here, these right here, these look pretty nice. This over here is what happens if you don't leave it on long enough. It's totally overgrown with ryegrass. Over here, we had just left it on for 2 more weeks. And you can see we're not having any weed pressure whatsoever. For anyone who's still hesitant about the idea of tarping, Steiner himself was asked about that, and he said it wouldn't do any harm as long as it wasn't left there for too long, which is true. If you leave a tarp out in the middle of summer, it will bake the soil, and you don't want to do that. My favorite time to tarp is late winter, going into spring, or if it's summer, a very short period of time. And I like to water that area thoroughly before I put the tarp on. If you tarp dead, dry soil, it will not matter if you tarp it, because weed seeds need water and warmth to germinate. So I put a sprinkler on there basically almost for 24 hours just to make sure it's thoroughly moistened. What I like to do is disturb the soil first. I like to add compost. I like to then work it into the soil, disturb the seed bed, then tarp it. So then when I pull it back, I have a light, fluffy soil that I can plant directly into without having to think about weed competition. It's just such an easy way to move things forward. This is a picture of the soil underneath. Yes, canvases. It's a great way to do it. Like it's such a good practice. It really is, and that's a wonderful way to do it. And I think I learned yesterday, yeah, and that the word canvas comes from cannabis. Did not know that before, but that's just a remarkable fact now. But here's the soil underneath the tarp. And this was just one that had been removed from a garden bed and just placed to the side. And this is what's happening under there. You can see it's very alive. There's nothing wrong with it. It's clearly not going anaerobic. It's not dying. This is not solarization. This is occultation. Solarization is when you bake the soil and basically you're pasteurizing it. Whereas that's not what we're after. We want to occult it. We want the warmth from the sun to enter the soil, interact with the water, cause the weed seeds to germinate, and then they die without sun. In late winter, we leave it on for, it depends, it really does. But I'll peel the tarp back to look at it. I'll say, all right, how are the weed seeds doing? If I don't see them, I leave it. I see them start to come up, I'm like, okay. And then I have to pull it back and see that they're all actually dead. Yes, in occulting, you can add local microorganism cultures. I like to spray the preparations, like the 500 horn manure before tarping. I spray, add compost, turn it all into the soil, and then tarp. With clear tarps, that's different. At that point, the problem is that the things underneath have light. You do not want them to have light. You want them to germinate and then die without light. If you're using clear tarps, to do it successfully, you'd almost need a solarization effect. My preferred way to turn compost into the soil with N500 is I use a power harrow. So instead of regular tillage, which works like this, it flips the layers. I don't do that. I use a power harrow which moves like this. So it's vertical tillage. So I'm not inverting any soil layers. They stay where they belong. So every year that I cultivate, the fertility increases. It gets deeper and deeper. Yes, you could do no-till, though it depends on your soil type. Some soils have a tendency to collapse and to die. No-till is not the cure-all answer. And even if you choose it, you will have to first deep rip in order to restore capillary action. Yeah, so you could do no-till. It depends on the soil, though. Not every soil is as suited to no-till. When I break up the soil, I spray the 500 horn manure, and I include all of those preparation herbs that you see. I make my horn manure, and then I add to the finished product all of the compost preparations. So when I spray it out, it's getting the influence of all of this all at once. And I do that every time I disturb the soil as a kind of maybe an apology or a gesture of gratitude. But when I break down what nature has built up, I give something back as a gesture. And yeah, I would turn these weeds into the soil. Yeah. And then I would spread compost, spray the preparations, turn them into the soil, and then immediately tarp so they don't have a chance to recover. And I found that cultivating and then tarping works a lot better because you shatter the root network. So they don't have a support network. It's a divide and conquer tactic where instead of there being a contiguous mat of ryegrass, which can then get resources from their friends that aren't tarped, you break it up, and then they will then surrender their vitality to the surrounding soil, and you will get what you want. And this is what it looks like. There's just all earthworm castings on the left, and on the right, that's what it looks like where we don't tarp. Like it's that stark of a difference. So what we're moving to next is not just controlling this amount of water that evaporates, but we're going to have to talk about then what happens if you get too much water. And that's where we're going to move into on the next talk, which is going to be about the soluble minerals, the salts. Too much water, you're going to leach out all of your minerals. And the connection to the brain and the root is if you don't have electrolytes in your brain isn't going to be firing its signals very well. If you don't have salts in the soil, there's no conductivity. The synapses of the roots can't fire, they can't communicate. Scientists actually did an experiment with electric eels in tanks, and they put them in distilled water. And they would put their hand into the water, and the electric eel can't shock them, because pure water without mineral salts can't conduct electricity. Now, the electric eels figured out what was going on and started jumping out of the water onto the scientists' arms and shocking them that way. So they still won. But so we need the salts in the soil. Some areas that are dry are going to have a lot more salt. Whereas like in anywhere that's in the east coast of North America is going to have a more acid soil and lose water. Yeah, if you don't have salt at all in water, the water can't be structured. It requires at least some salt. You could almost imagine salt will always, water always wants to become the ocean. That's its desire. It wants salt. So if you drink distilled water, that's really bad for you because it will actually take salt from you. It's not a good thing to drink. It's good if you're trying to like extract herbs or make medicines or even make tea. It'll pull things right out of that water, take everything out. But yeah, it's very, very hungry water. Exactly. So yeah, that's basically it. If we have another question, I don't know if we have time, but I know in 30 minutes will be the next keynote, I believe. Yeah.
Britt, this is fantastic. Gosh, I don't know what to say. I've learned a lot, and I've read the agriculture lectures 6 times, so this is great. How about we let everybody unmute themselves and say goodbye? Is there anything that you want to say before we head out for tomorrow, Stuart, or anything you want to?
No, that was a lot. I'm glad I got
That's a
through
lot.
it. I know you'll probably have questions. If you do in the meantime, you can try to bring them up tomorrow, and I'll try to address anything, because I know that now with 2 whole lectures, we're now going to have a lot of buildup of questions. You're going to be making your own connections, and you're going to start asking questions. So bring them tomorrow, and we'll see how we get to them. Like, we'll try to get as much as we can. So.
And you've mentioned a lot of books, and some of the, I just want to say to people there that on the biodynamics.com website in the marketplace, there's lots of things going on during the conference that are at discount for you. But one of them is the Josephine Porter Institute that does sell the preparations, make preparations and sell them. And they also have a pretty good bookstore for Steiner and other biodynamic things that you have 10% off there during the conference. And so some of the books that that Stuart might have mentioned, or if you want to go deeper into any of these topics, that might be a good thing to check out when you have a moment between sessions. Stuart, thank you. I'll try and unmute everybody so you can say thank you. And then hopefully I'll see you at Will Brenton's keynote talk. I think that starts in 30 minutes, just like Stuart said. And we'll be talking about soil health. That's his topic.
Yeah. Thank you.
Let's do it.
Thank you.
Chao,
Thank you.
gracias.
Thank you,
Buenas
Stuart.
tardes.
Thank you. That was great.
Thank you very much.
Gracias.
Thank